Hello and welcome. This is U.S. History 2202. This is Professor James Cement. This is the lecture 3 for week 5 on the Progressive Era.
Two sweethearts holding happily for quite a while, the simple life of country folk. The laddie told the girlie he must go away, on her little heart and grief most broke. Well, she said, you know I love you, honey, best of all. So, baby, don't go away. Just as he went to go, it grieved the girlie so. His words, a hard saying. Some of these days, oh, you miss me, honey. Some of these days, you're gonna be so lonely. You're gonna miss my hugging. You're gonna miss my kisses. You're gonna miss me, honey, when I'm far away. I feel so lonely, just for you only. You know, honey, I let you have your way. And when you leave me, I know will grieve me. You miss your little daddy some of these days.
What you just heard was a song by Sophie Tucker called Some of These Days. She was a Jewish immigrant singer, enormously popular in the early part of the 20th century during the Progressive Era. She came out of the Yiddish language theater. Now, Yiddish was itself it was the street language of the Jewry of Europe, and it has largely died out in the present day. A victim of the Nazi Holocaust. The use of Hebrew, the language of the ancient Jews, as the official language of modern-day Israel, and by the assimilation of Jews into American life over the past century. Now, Yiddish language theater in the early part of the 20th century was a very popular form of entertainment among Jewish immigrants in major metropolitan areas in the years when Yiddish was still widely spoken in immigrant communities. But as the original population of Jewish immigrants died or became so fluent in English that they preferred mainstream forms of entertainment, the Yiddish theater died out after World War II. So right now we're going to finish up our discussion of the Progressive Era. As we have been discussing this week, the Progressive Era was an era of political activism, a new expansive role for government, from breaking up the huge trust that dominated the American economy, to regulating the activities of business to protect consumers, prevent anti-competitive behaviors, better conserve natural resources, basically to rein in the power of big business and prevent some of its worst abuses. Progressivism was a mass movement of voters who demanded that their leaders in government would act on behalf of the people against the big moneyed interests. It was a new view of the role of the press in American life. It talked about the muckrakers who examined the awful conditions in the meatpacking plants, the corruption of big city machines, and the predatory practices of huge trusts like the Standard Oil Company. We talked about the role that the radical politicians and political movements, most notably the Socialist Party, which pushed for the radical notion of public ownership of the means of production. Though this remained a minority viewpoint, it revealed that many Americans felt that the system, the political and economic system of America, was so broken that it needed such radical changes. And the Progressive Party, the Progressive Movement, was a movement of reformist politicians, the most notable of which was no less than the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. But there were progressive politicians in many states around America and in many municipalities. We also talked about another strain within progressivism, the idea that reform and change should be based in science, not through the haphazard whims of politicians. Though we also discussed how such an approach sometimes ran counter to the democratic impulses of progressivism. Politicians, after all, are answerable to the people, appointed experts are not. This contradiction ran through progressivism as it has run through our government ever since, as our government has taken on more roles in the economic and social life of the nation. The idea of science, to apply cool, rational, evidence-based science to the many social problems America was facing, for example, the sanitation problems that the growing cities of the early 20th century were plagued by, the huge new cities and the gigantic industrial corporations that affected every aspect of life, and the need for experts in science to enact the social changes to deal with the problems of this new bigness in American life, whether it be providing safe food and drugs, conserving resources, assuring public health, enacting better social policy, that all of these things cannot be left to the mere profit motive, to the marketplace, and to politicians either bought by business or who manipulate public opinion to stay in office. Again, politicians would have said that they are responding to the people's will. Business would have said that it was providing what the consumers want. But progressives argued that sometimes the people were not the best guides of public policy, even as they were saying that we needed more democracy. It was a contradiction, a tension within progressivism, but as we said, this tension persists down to the present day. For example, how much should the government insist we cut back on greenhouse gases with better light bulbs in cars? Anti-reformers say leave this to the marketplace. Public opinion may not want it. Progressives say no. Experts say this climate change is dangerous and science says we must do something, so we must ban inefficient light bulbs and force car makers to make cars that get better mileage, even if the people want to drive big honking SUVs. Anyway, getting back to the progressive era again, we want to focus on another area of activism within the progressive movement, and that was in the area of labor. Some of these reforms came in the area of law, particularly in the area of child labor reform, and as we'll talk about a little bit, women's reforms that affected women in the workplace. So child labor was seen by many Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the progressive era and even beforehand as a scourge. That it was just awful that young children were working in factories and sweatshops and not going to school. And as these cartoons from newspapers in Philadelphia and Detroit around the year 1900 show. We discuss how the concept of freedom of contract in week 2 on industrialization, and it's covered in the text, of course, for that if you do the readings for that week. Proponents of freedom of contract argue that government should not try to legislate work conditions because this would interfere with workers' and business owners' freedom to negotiate labor conditions in any way they saw fit. But an exception was made for children, to a lesser extent, women. Why do you think that was? Why do you think the adult figures in these cartoons are shown as such mean and ruthless men? Well, obviously, anybody who exploits children is going to be widely seen as ruthless and awful. But the bigger point was that this was kind of a chink in the armor of the freedom of contract idea, and that is that, yes, while adults can negotiate as free individuals with bosses for the kind of conditions in which they'll labor, for wages and working conditions, everybody kind of understood that children were a little more helpless in this regard and were never possibly equal to the employers who employed them in terms of negotiating contracts. They were just children after all. And so some of the earliest labor reforms had to do with regulating whether children could work, what kinds of things children could work in, and whether they could be involved in work at all, whether it should be banned completely. And so this began sort of the eroding away of this idea of freedom of contract, that people are free and they can make whatever decisions they want, and government shouldn't interfere, shouldn't set wage conditions, working conditions, anything like that, because it should be left to the marketplace and should be left to free individuals to negotiate on their own. The chinks in this armor of freedom of contract idea also extended somewhat to women. The attitude among many Americans of that day was that women too are kind of like minors. I mean, it was a patronizing, condescending attitude towards women, but it did begin to sort of break down this idea of freedom of labor, or freedom of contract, I should say. That women too need more protection from the government. That the idea was that women needed protection from the exploitations of the marketplace more than men did, that they weren't as capable of negotiating in the free marketplace as men were, the conditions of their employment, and that the traditional idea that women needed protection from men, right, the sort of what we now see as kind of a very sexist viewpoint of things. But the idea was that in this age of bigness, that individual men could not protect their women, that what you needed was a kind of larger scale man, as it were, in the form of the government, to set rules and conditions under which women could work that would protect their femininity, that would protect their womanliness. And so we saw, for example, and I had you read a little bit about and it was in the text, the landmark 1908 Supreme Court decision of Mueller v. Oregon, in which the state of Oregon had put into effect conditions under which women could work. Now, normally in this era, the Supreme Court ruled against any kind of restrictions on the marketplace and on freedom of contract. But the justices argued that women were a special case. They needed special protections that men did not. And so again, you started to see this chink in the armor of this freedom of contract idea, which opened up the idea that government can regulate working conditions. And some of these changes in terms of laboring conditions and wages and that sort of thing were basically promoted by a new labor militancy, particularly among immigrant workers who were flooding into factories throughout the United States. Two of the most important events of this period, one was the ladies' garment workers' strike of 1909, and the other was the textile workers' strike, known as the Bread and Roses strike, because that was their motto of the time, that they needed bread, that is wages, and they also needed to be treated decently. Their social conditions should be improved, and that's the roses element of the Bread and Roses strike. And there were a wave of strikes during the Progressive Era that helped achieve better wages and better working conditions. Now, not all of these strikes were completely successful, but many of them were, and they did start to improve laboring conditions. This was part of the overall reform movements of the Progressive Era. Moreover, the labor activism of this era, the big strikes and the big movements and the big marches, helped to move public opinion more in the direction of protecting workers and of the idea that the government had a right to regulate conditions in the workplace, from not so much minimum wages, but for better working conditions and better laboring conditions in factories and sweatshops. In addition to that, there was a push for workmen's compensation laws, the first of which was passed in Wisconsin in 1911. Wisconsin, like New York and other states like that, were sort of progressive leaders, and they sort of set the pace for much of the rest of the nation. One of the most important and critical keystone events in the history of labor reforms of the Progressive Era concerned the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of March 25th, 1911. And to explain the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, I'd like you to watch this short video by a colleague. It explains what happens in great detail.
Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a man-made disaster, a tragedy of the industrial age, made all the worse because it could have been prevented. Let me set the scene. New York City, early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied several floors of a Manhattan business building called the Ash Building. It was located just off Washington Square Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, by almost any definition, a sweatshop. It was a densely packed place. Some 500 people worked there, and the work schedule was punishing. 11 to 12 hours a day, every day. Most of the people employed at the factory were young immigrant women, teenagers even, who didn't speak English. These women sat at long tables, day in, day out, sewing shirtwaists. Shirtwaists were mass-produced blouses. They resembled men's shirts and were very popular with working women. So here's what happened. March 25th, 1911, Saturday evening, the end of the workday, the work week. A fire started in a bin of cotton scraps, perhaps from a cigarette butt. A manager tried to use a hose to put it out, but the hose valve was rusted shut, and the hose itself was rotted away. The factory floor didn't have a sprinkler system, so the fire spread quickly. People panicked. The building had only one flimsy fire escape, and it wasn't nearly big enough. It collapsed. The building had 4 elevators, but only one was working, and it only held 12 people at a time. It managed to make 4 rescue trips before it broke down. Some desperate workers jumped to their deaths down the elevator shaft. Workers tried to take the stairs, but the exit doors only opened inward, and they were kept locked by factory management. Many people were crushed to death trying to get out. Firefighting technology hadn't caught up to the new tall buildings of a city like New York. The fire hoses and ladders could only reach the 7th floor. one floor short of the fire. Dozens of desperate workers jumped out of the windows. They chose to die from the fall instead of the flames. Other workers burned to death or died from smoke inhalation. The whole episode lasted just 18 minutes. 144 people were dead. 2 more died later in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 146. Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace. The fire was a key moment in the growth of labor unions, particularly the ILGWU, or International Ladies Garment Workers Union. New York City passed measures including the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which required sprinkler systems to be installed in all factories. It served as a model for state and national workplace safety codes. These measures made American workers safer, but they were too late for the workers who perished one terrible March day at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
The brief documentary that you saw highlights some of the issues that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire raises in terms of the progressive era. What it doesn't mention, though, is that all of the problems that existed at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in terms of the miserable working conditions, the long hours, the crowded conditions, the dangerous fire hazards, the fact that the owners kept the escapes locked, that the fire escapes were inadequate to support people trying to flee fires, all of the problems that the fire exposed, that all of these were aware that were known to fire inspectors and other city inspectors, and that they had been raised quite a bit in the years leading up to the fire tragedy. But that whenever reformers had gone before the state legislature to try to get legal reforms to prevent these kinds of conditions, workplace conditions, they were always thwarted because the moneyed interests, the people who own the various sweatshops and factories around New York City and other cities in New York State, had basically controlled the legislature and prevented any kind of meaningful legislation, any kind of legislation that would have teeth in it to prevent these kinds of abuses in the factories. And so when this factory fire happened, all of that became exposed, and people, the public demanded more, stricter legislation that would prevent tragedies like this happening in the future. The other thing that the brief documentary discusses is the inadequacy of the fire department in New York City to deal with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, that the hoses and the ladders did not reach up to the 8th floor. And this raises another point about the progressive era, and that is, sort of coping with the new bigness of American life, the big cities, and that the fact that the older establishment, the older government of the cities was just not up to the task of dealing with this bigness, in this case actually rather tallness of the new cities, that the fire department, which had first been organized 50 and 75 years earlier, sort of haphazardly, and sort of grown up in a non-systematic way, that it needed reforms, and it needed to be reorganized along modern scientific firefighting principles. And so this sort of, again, brings us back to the point that the use of experts and technology and all that sort of thing to make the cities able to cope with their new bigness was a big part of the progressive era reforms, and it's evidenced in the tragedy that happened at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911. Another aspect of the progressive movement, one of its facets or one of its defining principles, was the idea that was coming into play that people were shaped by their social conditions, by the environment which they grew up in. The old social Darwinist idea that people were, determined by their race, determined by their ethnic background, determined by their class, that it was a survival of the fittest kind of atmosphere, and those who fell behind were victims of their own weakness, of their own inadequacy, of their own inability to survive. That sort of began to give way in the progressive era to the idea that people were shaped by their social environment. That if people were failing to get ahead in life, if people were falling prey to becoming criminals and unemployed or whatever, that it was the social and economic conditions that caused this to happen. And therefore, the sort of corollary to that is that if you could improve those social and environmental conditions, you could make people better, you could improve society. And of course, using the idea of experts and science to create better social conditions, to create better people through an activist government. That was a big part of the progressive era and the progressive movement. One of the ways this can be seen was in the movement to improve housing conditions and a wave of tenement reform laws that were passed in many cities across America, starting in New York City, but extending to places like San Francisco and Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston, to improve housing conditions in the big cities where millions of immigrants were pouring into. As noted in earlier slides in this series, which dealt with problems addressed by federal laws and agencies, the desire for reform in the progressive era permeated all levels of government, including municipal governments, some of whom, like that of New York City's or Chicago's, passed laws to improve housing conditions. Tenements were seen as these sort of awful places for people to live. They were crowded full of newcomers to the city into tiny apartments with little in the ways of ventilation, light, sanitation, outdoor space, or other basic amenities. And so the idea was that if you could improve people's housing conditions, if you could make tenements more decent places to live, then people would have more hope. They would be improved. They would become better people, and this would diminish crime and other social problems in the big cities. As you can see in this cartoon from the satirical magazine, sort of satirical political magazine of the progressive era, called Puck, how is this idea conveyed in the political cartoon you see here? What are some of the ills conveyed by the ghost-like figures coming out of the tenement building? Did the reformers think passing laws to improve conditions in tenements would accomplish? And basically the idea was that if you gave people better places to live, they would become better people. They would, as I said before, would not tend towards crime. They would become more educated. They would become more hopeful. They would try to improve themselves, and that all of this would help society generally, even as social conditions improved, would help people live a better and more fulfilling and more prosperous life. And so New York City passed a number of laws to improve tenement conditions, and you can sort of see the layouts of the tenements as they improve over the years due to these laws to bring in more light and better and more safety. For example, you see fire escapes are added to the front of buildings. You can see these sort of courtyards in between the buildings to allow for more ventilation. And the idea, of course, is to make these living spaces better for the people, and that would improve their lives and also improve social conditions in the city. There were also moves to make public sanitation better. And in fact, if we look at the health conditions in the cities, they begin to improve during the progressive era. In fact, measures of health and healthy living conditions were largely that improved during the first years of the 20th century were largely due not to advances in medicine, not to great medical achievements, but more in terms of the realms of public health. And again, it was applying the ideas of bringing public experts in science to improve the conditions within the city. In this case, the idea that if you can clean up the cities more adequately with a more professional sanitation department that is run along scientific and rational principles, you'll be able to clean up the streets and improve public health generally. And if you improve public health generally, you improve people generally, and you improve sort of social conditions, and you make life better for everybody, not just the poor, but all citizens of the city. And so the idea was, bringing in reforms based on scientific and rational public health principles to improve people's lives. That was one of the key sort of hallmarks of the progressive era. There was a big push to create parks throughout the metropolitan areas during the progressive era. The idea, again, was that if you could give children places to play in public that weren't the streets, where they weren't going to, get involved in crime and in gambling and other things that, other bad vices that children and teenagers might get involved with, that if you gave them healthy, wholesome places to play with fresh air and trees and playing equipment, as you can see in this picture, you can make children better. And of course, if you make children better, you'll make the adults that they grow into better citizens. And that, again, was a key element of the progressive reforms, particularly in municipal areas of this era. Now, one of the key social problems that many progressives saw during the early years of the 20th century was the problem of alcohol. Now, today, the idea of banning alcohol does not seem like a particularly progressive move. Many progressives today argue that our prohibitions on illegal drugs have contributed to crime and other problems in society, that they should be legalized. But in the progressive era, there was this attitude among many reformers that if you looked at many of the social problems that America was facing, whether it be crime, whether it be domestic violence, a big issue at the time, because it was seen as an outgrowth of alcohol abuse by husbands. And as you can see from this cartoon about the evils of alcohol, you can see the Prohibition Party, which favored the banning of alcohol, stamping out all the sort of evil octopus. And of course, we saw the octopus in all of those cartoons about big business. It was a popular image of political cartoonists. And if you look at the various arms of this octopus of alcohol, you see political corruption, you see partnership with thieves, you see gambling, trafficking in girls, prostitution, defiance of the law, all this sorts of things. And at the heart of it, of course, was the saloon itself. And many progressives also equated the saloon with the machine politics of the time, because as we've discussed a week ago when we were talking about immigration and urbanization in early 20th century America, that the saloon was the center of where many of the political machines operated. That's where you interacted with officers or members of the political machine to get the kind of help that you might have needed from the political machine. It was where it operated out of to buy votes and to control the electorate. And so by banning the saloon, it was hoped you would ban the political machines. And the saloon was also seen, of course, as the epicenter of the alcohol problem in America, and that the alcohol problem caused all of these social problems. And so the idea was that in the progressive era, if you could ban alcohol from the United States, you would improve all of these other social conditions. The idea, again, it was kind of related to the other conditions, other issues that we talked about in terms of tenement reform, more public parks, better sanitation. And one of the reforms should be the banning of alcohol, because that would create social conditions that would lead people, to become better citizens, and improve society generally. That allowing alcohol to continue to flow, you were creating social conditions that would bring people down, would bring them to crime, to gambling, to poverty, and to domestic abuse and all that sort of thing. And so gradually the movement to ban alcohol in the United States, the prohibition movement, gained steam during the progressive era, as state after state began banning alcohol, and as the prohibitionists began to push for a constitutional amendment, what would turn out to be the 18th Amendment, which was ratified at the end of 1918. It was ratified at the end of 1918 and went into effect in 1919. And of course, as it turned out, prohibition would turn out to be a social disaster, because it did not obviously prevent people from imbibing in alcohol. In fact, some historians have argued that it actually encouraged it. But for 14 years, alcohol was banned in the United States. Actually, the prohibition of alcohol contributed to many of the social problems that the prohibitionists had wanted to stop by banning alcohol, particularly in the area of crime. That with the banning of alcohol, you created, you encouraged, and you kind of gave a sort of turbocharged organized crime in the era, because it became a huge business to supply the millions of people in America who continued to drink with their alcohol. And that turbocharging of organized crime was one of the many reasons why the ban was overturned in the early 1930s with another constitutional amendment that went into effect in 1933. And finally, we want to take a look at one of the other aspects of the progressive era, the progressive movement of the early 20th century, and that was to extend, sort of make democracy more extensive, to include more people, to make it more answerable to the people. And perhaps the most important of the reforms was, of course, the extension of the vote, or the suffrage, as it is called, to to half the population, to the women of the United States. Today, if we were to be talking about the women's vote, I mean, most people would argue that it is simply a matter of equality, that women are equal to men and therefore have just as much right to participate in the politics of America, to the governance of America as men. We just sort of accept in our 21st century minds and our 21st century society that women are the equal of men, and that it is just sort of obviously and apparent that they should participate as equals in the political sphere. But actually in the progressive era, a lot of this was filtered through ideas about gender. So if we take a look at it, no political issue of the progressive era was more contentious than that of extending the vote to women. There were a lot of people who were opposed to it, but of course it was finally achieved with the 19th Amendment, which went into effect in 1920. And these three cartoons present the two sides of the argument. The two yellowed cartoons on the left, what are they obviously arguing is in favor of women's involvement in politics and giving women the vote. If we look at the cartoon in the upper left, what do we see? What is it trying to convey? It is trying to convey that women are reaching a new kind of maturity, leaving behind silly pastimes or silly preoccupations with fashion and gossip. They're looking over the fence of this area that confines them, this woman's sphere, to keep them in the home, where where all they can think about is fashion and gossip, to looking beyond it to the larger world outside. The cartoon on the bottom left addresses one of the big issues that anti-suffrage politicians and Americans were promoting, and the idea which was the idea that extending the vote to women would corrupt them by bringing them into the corrupt world of politics, or the sort of the dirty world of politics. And of course, in that lower left-hand corner cartoon, you can see that what it's trying to emphasize is that women can certainly be good mothers, good wives, and still participate in the voting process. The idea was that even though they would be voting, they would not necessarily be leaving behind the essential roles of women to raise children and to be good wives and to keep decent homes. Again, the argument was not to create necessarily social equality for women with the vote. It was simply to allow them to participate. And the argument, of course, in favor of giving women the vote was that they would bring their feminine natures to the political process, which would only serve to improve the political process. It was seen that women were more compassionate, more empathic, more emotional than men, and that this would actually make American politics a better thing, that it would lead to better legislation that would improve the lives of all Americans, because women would be more concerned about preserving the home. So, for example, one of the big pushes for the women's vote was that it would actually get things like prohibition through, because women suffered from alcoholism more than men. I don't mean that they were bigger drinkers than men, but that they suffered from some of the ills that alcohol brought, in particular domestic violence, but also prohibition, also prostitution. So the idea was that if we could get women into the political sphere, that they would bring their higher nature. Women were placed on a pedestal, they were seen as more pure than men, and that they would bring this to politics, and it would improve politics in America, to getting things like prohibition through. There was also sort of a racial and ethnic element to granting women the vote, and that was that, if all these ignorant immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, the men that is, were gaining the vote, we needed to counteract it with decent, good, all-American, native-born American women, get their votes into the hopper, into the ballot box, to counteract these ignorant, undemocratic immigrant voters that we talked about last week. Now, as you can see on the cartoon on the right, sort of the anti-women's vote argument was basically the idea that, if you allowed women to vote, they would leave the home behind. They would leave behind their traditional role, and this was considered to be, a terrible thing. That you can see in this cartoon, the man has been left with the children to raise them. The woman, who's dressed up kind of in a men's outfit, it's like her femininity is being undermined by the vote. She's starting to wear men's clothes, at least the upper half of her body is, and that she's leaving the man behind. She's leaving the home behind, and that politics would make women more masculine, that it would take them out of the home. Also that it would, sort of be corrupting of them, that they would lose their feminine principles, they'd lose their purity. by entering the political sphere, because the political sphere is sort of an ugly world in which, it's all about money, and it's all about influence, and it's all about things like that, and that this would corrupt women, and it would ruin society generally, and it would upset the home, and it would upset the traditional roles of men and women, and it would upset child rearing, and all kinds of social evils would arise if we gave women the vote. So the more important points to note that extending the vote to women, which was achieved in 1920, about 100 years ago next year, that it was all seen in sort of very gender-specific terms. It was all seen as, granting the women the vote was a way of bringing feminine principles, as seen during that era, into politics, which would be a good thing, and that the anti-women's vote was all seen as that it would take women out of their traditional roles, out of the home, out of child rearing, out of being good wives, and would ruin them because of that. Finally, we can also note that progressivism had a kind of a foreign policy component. We'll be talking about this more next week, but the idea was that all of these sort of progressive impulses to make society better, to apply science and expertise, to improve democracy, to improve social conditions, that there was, in a sense, a duty for Americans to extend those progressive ideas to the world at large. And so part of the imperial impulse, because of course in this era America takes on an empire for the first time in the Caribbean and the Pacific, was to extend these progressive ideas to other countries. Now, of course, in this cartoon, you can sort of see it as a very paternalistic and even racist viewpoint. That is, that these peoples needed American tutelage. They needed America to instruct them on these better ways of life, in sort of a very paternalistic and racially derogatory way. But the progressive impulse was partly behind some of this imperialist ideas that America should extend out into the world to spread its higher ideals, its better democracy, its better way of life to these ignorant and backward peoples of the world. Many historians, when they sort of outline the era of progressivism, they oftentimes sort of say it ends with World War I. But in many ways, World War I was sort of an outgrowth of progressivism. As we discussed, progressivism, was an impulse behind the imperialist ideals of the era, the idea of spreading American values and American institutions to, sort of to the non-white parts of the world that America was absorbing into its new empire. But progressivism also explains America's relationship to Europe. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I, and one of the reasons, one of the justifications for the war, there were many, and we'll be talking about those next week when we talk about America's involvement in World War I. One of them was to make the world safe for democracy. The idea was that, American democratic ideals as personified in the progressive movement should be spread to the sort of corrupt world of European politics. And that was one of the justifications for America's entry into the war in April of 1917. Then, with the war's end, 19 months later, President Woodrow Wilson, who was a strong progressive thinker, hoped to spread democracy and prevent future wars by creating an international organization known as the League of Nations. And again, we'll be going into more detail about this next week. But in the wake of the war, many Americans became disillusioned by the power politics of our former allies and were growing weary of the many crusades of the progressive era. Ultimately, the Senate voted against Wilson, opting not to have the country join the League. And we'll take a look at one of the arguments against America joining the League next week. But again, we can sort of see in this idea of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations, of course, was the idea of a kind of an institution, international institution that would bring in all the nations of the world. Of course, the nations of the world then were much more restricted than they are now, because much of the world was under the control of European empires. But the idea was that Wilson's idea, his progressive idea, was to create a democratic institution in the League of Nations that would prevent wars, that would prevent conflict around the world, that would resolve disputes among nations, and would spread the idea of democracy throughout the world, very much of a progressive ideal. But in the wake of World War I, when the negotiations were happening to set the peace and set the terms for the post-war era, what Americans saw was the European nations playing the old power politics game, and it disillusioned them. And, there is an argument to be made that disillusionment with what happened with the League of Nations, of course, America votes to never, the Senate, as we said, voted to prevent American membership in the League of Nations, that disillusionment with international politics helped to kind of poison the attitudes about progressivism even at home. And so, as I said before, many historians sort of cite the World War I as sort of ending the progressive era. But of course, progressive ideas continued through the 1920s, and they would be reborn with the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression and in the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. So next week we will take a look at, we will go overseas and take a look at America's new expansive role in the world, first by examining America's new empire that it gained in the 1890s, and then we'll take a look at America's entry into World War I and what that meant. So thank you for listening to this lecture, and we'll see you all on Monday.